The eternal conflict. The stars had watched them fight for 800,000 years. Two alien races locked in a war so old that neither side could remember how it started. The Kethmaran and the Velthari had been killing each other since before Earth's sun was born. The Kethmaran looked like giant lizards covered in living crystal. Their bodies shined with different colors when light hit them. They were 10 feet tall and moved slowly but with great purpose. Their ships were huge metal fortresses that floated through space like moving mountains. These ships carried weapons that could turn entire planets into dust. The Velthari were stranger still. They were made of something like living rock that could change shape. They did not need to breathe air or drink water. They could live in the cold emptiness of space as easily as on a planet. Their ships were not built but grown. These living vessels could heal themselves when damaged and could change their shape during battle. Both races had forgotten what they were fighting about. Some old records spoke of mining rights in a distant star system. Others mentioned trading disputes. But after 800,000 years, the reason did not matter anymore. The war had become their entire way of life. Young Kethmaran children learned to handle weapons before they could walk properly. Their schools taught nothing but military tactics and how to kill Velthari. Every song they sang was about glorious battles. Every story they told was about brave warriors who died fighting their enemies. The Velthari had changed even more. They had turned their own bodies into living weapons. Their children were born already knowing how to fight. They could not think about anything except war. Peace was not just unknown to them. It was impossible for their minds to understand. The war followed strict patterns that had not changed for thousands of years. Both sides would gather their fleets at agreed locations. They would fight according to rules that both sides knew by heart. After the battle, they would return to their home worlds to build new ships and train new soldiers. Then they would do it all again. Entire star systems existed only to make weapons and warships. Billions of beings lived their whole lives doing nothing but preparing for war. Planets were stripped bare to provide metal for guns and armor. The war consumed everything and gave nothing back except more death. Admiral Kethvar commanded the Crystalline Fleet. He was 300 years old and had fought in over 2,000 battles. His body was covered in scars and his crystal skin had turned dark from centuries of combat. He knew every Velthari fighting technique. He could predict their moves before they made them. War singer Velnash led the living armada. She was even older than Kethvar. Her body had been changed by centuries of warfare until she was more weapon than being. She could communicate directly with her living ships. Her hatred for the Kethmaran burned like a star in her chest. Today they would meet again at the Threnody system. This was a dead star surrounded by floating rocks and the wreckage of countless old battles. The two fleets had been fighting here for 50,000 years. The space around the dead star was filled with the bones of destroyed ships from both sides. Kethvar studied the tactical displays on his flagship. Everything was as it should be. His 500 ships were arranged in the traditional crystal formation. Each ship knew its role. Each captain understood the battle plan that had been used for millennia. Velnash felt her fleet moving into position through her connection to the living ships. 800 vessels that pulsed with organic life, ships that could think and feel and hate just as much as their crews. They hungered for battle with an appetite that could never be satisfied. Neither commander noticed the small ship that appeared at the edge of the system. It was tiny compared to their massive fleets. Its metal hull was old and scarred. It did not look like a warship. It did not move like a warship. It simply hung in space and watched. The ship was alone. One vessel against two fleets that together carried over 1 million warriors. It should have been destroyed immediately or fled in terror. Instead, it did something that had not happened in 800,000 years. It waited. Kethvar saw the unknown ship on his scanners. His crystal skin flashed red with anger. How dare some fool interrupt their sacred battle? He ordered his weapons crews to target the intruder. Velnash felt the same rage flow through her living ships. The fleet's hatred focused on this small vessel that dared to enter their ancient battlefield. Her ships began to move toward it like predators sensing prey. But the small ship did not flee. It did not fight back. It did not even raise defensive shields. It simply broadcast a message on all communication channels that both fleets used. The voice was calm and female. It spoke an accented galactic standard that neither race had heard before. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the human vessel Peacemaker. I am requesting permission to mediate this conflict. For the first time in 800,000 years, both fleets stopped moving, not because they were ordered to, but because they did not understand what they had just heard. Mediate? What did that word even mean? The Kethmoran language had no word for peacekeeping. The Velthari could not process the concept of stopping a fight without total victory. Both races had evolved beyond the ability to think about anything except war. Kethvar stared at his communication screen. His crystal skin flickered through confused colors. In all his centuries of battle, no one had ever asked to stop a fight. The very idea was alien to him. Velnash felt her living ships pulse with uncertainty. They could sense her confusion, and it spread through the entire fleet like a disease. The ships began to drift out of formation as their crews struggled to understand what was happening. The small human ship continued to wait patiently in the darkness between the two massive fleets. Captain Sarah Chen watched the tactical displays and smiled sadly. She had studied these two races for months. She knew what 800,000 years of continuous war had done to them. They had forgotten how to be anything except soldiers. They had lost the ability to imagine a world without enemies. The war had eaten their souls and left behind only hatred and the need to fight. But Chen remembered something that both races had forgotten. She remembered what they had been before the war began. She had found records in ancient databases, images and stories from a time when both races had been builders instead of destroyers. The Kethmoran had once been artists and philosophers. Their crystal bodies could create music that made entire worlds weep with beauty. They had built cities that captured starlight and turned it into living art. The Velthari had been explorers and gardeners. They had used their shape-changing abilities to terraform dead worlds into gardens of incredible beauty. They had spread life throughout the galaxy instead of death. Both races had families and dreams and hopes that had nothing to do with warfare. They had loved and laughed and created beautiful things, but 800,000 years of killing had buried all of that under layers of hate and violence. Now Chen had 50 minutes to remind them of what they had lost. 50 minutes to end a war that had lasted longer than most civilizations existed. 50 minutes to give two dying races back their souls. She took a deep breath and began to speak. The interloper Captain Sarah Chen had been traveling alone for 3 years. Her ship, the Peacemaker, was the first of its kind. Humanity had only recently learned how to travel faster than light. Most human ships were explorers or traders, but the Peacemaker was different. It was built for something that most aliens could not understand: making peace. Chen was 42 years old and had spent her entire adult life studying conflicts between different species. She had a gift for seeing past the anger and hatred to find the real causes of war. On Earth, she had helped end 3 civil wars and 2 border disputes. Now she was trying to do the same thing among the stars. The human government had sent her to catalog the various wars happening across the galaxy. Most were simple territorial disputes or fights over resources. These could usually be solved with trade agreements or boundary treaties. But the Kethmoran and Velthari conflict was different. It was older than human civilization. It was a wound in space itself that had been bleeding for geological ages. Chen had spent months studying both races from a distance. She had read their ancient histories and analyzed their languages. What she found made her heart ache with sadness. Both species had once been capable of incredible beauty and creation. Now they were trapped in a cycle of violence that they could not break. The Peacemaker was not a warship. It carried no weapons except for basic defensive systems. Instead, it was filled with something far more powerful: information. Every peace treaty in human history was stored in its computers. Every successful negotiation, every conflict resolution technique, every story of former enemies becoming friends. More importantly, Chen carried something that neither the Kethmoran nor the Velthari possessed anymore: perspective. She could see their war from the outside. She could understand what 800,000 years of fighting had done to their minds and souls. As she watched the two fleets prepare for battle, Chen ran detailed scans of their technology. What she discovered was both fascinating and tragic. Both civilizations had become completely specialized for war against each other. They were like two keys that had been shaped to fit only one lock. Without each other to fight, neither race could function. The Kethmoran had eliminated every aspect of their culture that was not directly useful for military purposes. Their art, their philosophy, their science. Everything had been sacrificed to make them better warriors. They were evolutionary dead ends, unable to adapt to anything except killing Velthari. The Velthari had gone even further. They had physically changed themselves into living weapons. Their bodies could no longer experience pleasure or joy or love. They could only feel the satisfaction of destroying their enemies. They had transformed themselves into organic machines programmed for a single purpose: war. Their weapons were incredibly advanced. Their tactics were perfect. They knew each other so well that every battle played out like a carefully choreographed dance. Each side could predict exactly what the other would do in any situation. It was not really warfare anymore. It was ritual combat that neither side could escape from. Chen activated her communication systems and broadcast her message to both fleets. She kept her voice calm and gentle, the way she had learned to speak when dealing with traumatized soldiers on Earth. These alien warriors were traumatized too, even if they did not realize it. The response was immediate and violent. Both fleets turned their weapons toward her tiny ship. For a moment, the ancient enemies were united in their fury at this unprecedented interruption of their sacred war. Thousands of targeting systems locked onto the Peacemaker. Energy weapons charged to full power. Missile tubes flooded with projectiles. In seconds, Chen could be reduced to scattered atoms drifting in space. But she did not flee. She did not raise shields or power weapons. She simply waited, trusting in something that both alien races had forgotten existed: restraint. The Kethmoran had not fired on a neutral party in 300,000 years. There had been no neutral parties for that long. Everyone in the galaxy either supported one side or the other, or stayed far away from the war entirely. The Velthari were programmed to destroy threats to their survival. But the small human ship posed no threat. It carried no weapons capable of harming their massive vessels. It made no aggressive moves. Their instincts, shaped by millennia of warfare, did not know how to respond to something that refused to be an enemy. Admiral Cathvar was the first to hesitate. His crystal skin flickered through colors of confusion. In 800,000 years of warfare, no one had ever simply refused to participate in violence. Every ship that entered their space was either friend, enemy, or prey. This human vessel fit none of those categories. Warsinger Velnash felt her living ship's pulse with uncertainty. They could sense prey that did not flee and enemies that did not fight back. The concept was so alien to them that their organic brains could not process it properly. Chen watched her scanners as the weapon systems slowly powered down. Not all of them, and not quickly, but enough to show that her gamble was working. She had bet her life on the idea that even after 800,000 years of war, some small part of both races still remembered what it meant to show mercy. Unknown vessel. Admiral Kethvar's voice crackled over the communication system. His translator was struggling with concepts that the Kethmoran language had no words for. State your purpose, Chen smiled. It was the first time in 800,000 years that a Kethmoran had asked a question that was not related to military tactics. It was a tiny crack in the wall of violence that surrounded both races, but it was enough. I am here to help you remember what you are fighting for, she replied. The question hung in space like a new star being born. In 800,000 years of conflict, neither side had ever stopped to consider why they were fighting. The war had become its own justification. It existed because it had always existed. It continued because it had always continued. But Chen's simple question struck at the very foundation of both civilizations. Why were they fighting? What were they trying to achieve? What did victory even look like after 800,000 years? Neither Admiral Kethvar nor Warsinger Velnash could answer. The question was so foreign to their way of thinking that it was like asking them to explain colors to the blind or music to the deaf. For the first time in 800,000 years, both fleets simply stopped. Engines powered down to minimum. Weapon systems went into standby mode. Ships held their positions but made no aggressive moves. Across thousands of vessels, beings that had known nothing but war began to struggle with a concept that their minds could barely grasp. What if there was another way? Chen began her next transmission, and with it she would begin to tear down a wall of hatred that had taken 800,000 years to build. But first she had to show them what they had forgotten. She had to remind them of who they used to be before the war consumed their souls. The impossible proposition: What happened next had never occurred in the recorded history of either civilization. The tiny human vessel simply hung in space between two massive fleets, waiting with infinite patience. Captain Chen made no demands, issued no threats, and showed no fear. She simply existed in the space between them like a bridge that neither side knew how to cross, Admiral. Kethavar found himself in a situation that his 300 years of military training had never prepared him for. Every protocol in the Kethmaran military manual dealt with enemies, allies, or prey. None of them explained what to do with someone who refused to be any of those things. His crystal skin flickered through a rainbow of confused colors as he stared at the tactical display. The human ship registered as unarmed except for basic defensive systems. It showed no hostile intent, but it also refused to leave their sacred battlefield. The situation was unprecedented. Warsinger Velnash experienced similar confusion, but her reaction was more visceral. Her living ships could sense her uncertainty, and it spread through the fleet like ripples in a pond. Ships that had maintained perfect formation for millennia began to drift slightly out of position as their organic minds struggled to process this new situation. The Velthari had evolved beyond the ability to feel curiosity or wonder. Their emotions had been streamlined down to hatred, anger, and the joy of victory. But now, faced with something completely outside their experience, a new sensation stirred in the depths of their collective consciousness. For the first time in 800,000 years, they wanted to understand rather than destroy. Chen waited 10 full minutes before speaking again. She had studied both races extensively and knew that rushing them would trigger their defensive instincts. They needed time to process the impossibility of a non-combatant in their war zone. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "I know this is confusing for both of you. You have been fighting so long that you have forgotten there are other ways to solve problems. But I am here to remind you of something you have lost." She began transmitting data, but not the kind that either fleet expected. No military intelligence, no tactical information, no strategic advantages. Instead, she sent them something far more dangerous to their way of life: history. The first transmission contained records of what the Kethmaran had been before the war began. Ancient files that Chen had discovered in deep space archaeological sites. Images of crystal cities that sang with harmonious music. Recordings of Kethmaran philosophers discussing the nature of beauty and truth. Art that had been created not to glorify war, but to celebrate life itself. Admiral Kethvar watched the data stream with growing amazement. His people had once been capable of creating beauty that could make entire worlds weep with joy. Their crystal bodies had been instruments of art, not weapons of war. They had built cities that captured starlight and transformed it into living symphonies. He had never seen anything like it. The modern Kethmaran had no concept of art for its own sake. Everything they created was designed for military purposes. Their songs were marching chants. Their stories were battle reports. Their architecture was fortresses and bunkers. But these ancient records showed a different people entirely. Kethmaran who laughed and loved and created beautiful things simply because they could. The revelation shook him to his core. The second transmission was even more devastating. Chen sent the Velthari records of their own forgotten past. Images of living ships that had been used not for war, but for exploration and terraforming. Videos of Velthari gardeners who could transform dead worlds into gardens of incredible beauty. Warsinger Velnash felt something break inside her mind as she processed the information. Her people had once been nurturers of life, not dealers of death. They had used their shape-changing abilities to heal broken ecosystems and spread life throughout the galaxy. They had been explorers who saw each new world as a canvas for creation. The living ships of her fleet began to pulse with emotions that had no names in their current language. Memory, perhaps. Longing for something they had never experienced but somehow remembered. The organic hulls rippled with patterns that resembled the ancient garden ships from the historical records. Chen's third transmission was the most revolutionary of all. She showed both races recordings of human conflicts and how they had been resolved. Wars that had ended not in total victory for one side, but in negotiated peace that benefited everyone. Enemies who had become friends. Adversaries who had learned to work together for common goals. The concept was so alien to both fleets that many could not even process it. Peace was not just unknown to them. It was literally impossible for their minds to understand. They had evolved beyond the ability to conceive of a world without enemies. But Chen was patient. She explained each concept slowly and clearly, using simple words and concrete examples. She showed them human cities where former enemies worked side by side. She played recordings of soldiers who had laid down their weapons and become farmers, teachers and artists. Most importantly, she asked them questions that neither race had considered for 800,000 years. "What do you want to build when the fighting stops?" she asked. "What dreams do you have that are not about war? What would you do if you did not have enemies to fight?" The questions hung in space like bombs waiting to explode. Neither Admiral Kethvar nor Warsinger Velnash could answer them. Their languages did not have words for dreams that were not about military victory. Their minds could not conceive of building something that was not designed for war, but the questions would not go away. They burrowed into the consciousness of both fleets like seeds planted in fertile soil. Warriors who had never thought about anything except killing began to wonder what they might create. Instead of destroy, Chen's final transmission of this phase was personal messages from humans who had lived through wars and found peace afterwards, soldiers who had put down their weapons and picked up tools, generals who had become diplomats, enemies who had become friends, lovers, even family. She showed them that war was not the natural state of intelligent beings. Conflict could end. Enemies could become allies. Destruction could be replaced with creation. It was possible to choose peace even after generations of warfare. For the first time in 800,000 years, both fleets began to dream of something other than victory. The idea was small and fragile, like a flower growing in the cracks of a bombed-out building. But it was there, and it was growing. Admiral Kethvar looked at his tactical displays, and for the first time in his life, he did not see targets to destroy. He saw individuals who might have families, dreams, and hopes just like he did. The realization terrified him. Warsinger Velnash felt her hatred beginning to crack like ice in spring. Underneath the anger and violence, she found something she had thought was dead forever. Curiosity about these beings she had been fighting for so long. The war that had lasted 800,000 years began to die in that moment. Not with explosions or surrender, but with questions that had no military answers and dreams that had nothing to do with victory. Chen smiled as she watched the sensor readings from both fleets. Weapons were powering down. Ships were dropping out of attack formations. Most importantly, communication channels that had carried nothing but threats and tactical data for millennia were beginning to carry something new. Questions. The impossible was becoming possible. Peace was taking root in the void between two ancient enemies. The unraveling Captain Chen did something that would be remembered for millennia as either the bravest or most foolish act in galactic history. She opened a three-way communication channel connecting herself with both Admiral Kethvar and Warsinger Velnash. For the first time in 800,000 years, the supreme commanders of both fleets were talking to each other about something other than surrender terms or battle plans. The silence stretched for long minutes. Neither alien commander knew how to begin a conversation that was not about war. Their languages had evolved to be efficient tools of military communication. Neither had words for the complex emotions they were experiencing. Chen broke the silence with gentle patience. "Admiral Kethvar, Warsinger Velnash, I want you to do something that might seem strange. I want you to tell each other about something beautiful from your home worlds. Not strategic information, not military assets, something that makes you happy to remember." The request was so alien that both commanders initially thought it was some sort of psychological warfare tactic. But Chen's voice carried no deception, no hidden agenda. She genuinely wanted them to share something personal and non-military. Admiral Kethvar was the first to speak, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. On Kethmore Prime there are crystal formations in the deep caverns. When the morning light hits them, they sing. The sound—" He paused, struggling with emotions that had been buried for centuries. "The sound reminds me of my mother's voice when I was a child." The admission shocked him more than any battle wound ever had. He had not thought about his mother in 200 years. Military efficiency had no room for such memories. But now they came flooding back. A crystal-skinned woman who had sung him to sleep with melodies that made the walls themselves hum in harmony. Warsinger. Velnash felt something stir in the deepest parts of her mind. Genetic memories that predated the war, inherited from ancestors who had known peace. Our breeding pools on Veltar were surrounded by gardens of living stone. We would shape them into forms that changed with the seasons. I remember the feeling of creation instead of destruction. Her living ships pulsed with sympathetic emotions. The organic hulls rippled with patterns that had not been seen for millennia. The decorative displays of a people who had once created art for the pure joy of it. Chen watched the readings from both fleets and smiled. Weapons systems were going offline. Not being powered down for maintenance, but actually being shut off as if they were no longer needed. Ships were drifting out of their rigid military formations into more natural, organic patterns. Tell me more, she encouraged gently. What else do you remember about life before the war consumed everything? The conversation that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Two beings who had been created to hate each other began to discover that they had more in common than either had ever imagined. Both species had originally been builders rather than destroyers. The Kethmoran had constructed cities that were works of art, using their crystal bodies to create architecture that was alive with light and music. The Velthari had been gardeners of worlds, using their shape-changing abilities to terraform dead planets into living paradises. Both races had valued knowledge, beauty, and growth. Both had families and loved ones. Both had dreams that had nothing to do with warfare. The war had not only robbed them of these things, it had made them forget that such things were even possible. As they talked, other members of both fleets began to listen in on the communication channel. Warriors who had known nothing but hatred began to hear their enemies speak of love, loss, hope, and wonder. The rigid hierarchies that had kept both militaries functioning for millennia began to crack as individuals remembered they were more than just soldiers. Commander Velkith, captain of a Velthari assault ship, found herself remembering songs her grandmother had taught her, songs about growing flowers in the void between stars, about healing wounded worlds, about the joy of creation. Captain Kethros, leader of a crystal squadron, recalled ancient stories about his people's philosophers who had spent their lives contemplating the nature of beauty and truth, stories that had been banned from military schools because they were deemed irrelevant to combat effectiveness. The breakthrough came when war singer Velnash made an offhand comment about the asteroid fields around the dead star. They remind me of the stone gardens my ancestors created. There is an accidental beauty in their formation. Admiral Kethvar found himself agreeing before his military training could stop him. Yes, I see it too. The way the light from distant stars catches the mineral formations. My people's ancient art was inspired by such patterns. The moment of shared aesthetic appreciation struck both commanders like lightning. They were not just agreeing about military tactics or strategic assessments. They were sharing a moment of genuine beauty, seeing the same wonder in the cold void of space. Chen seized the opportunity. What if instead of fighting over these spaces, you worked together to create something beautiful? What if you turned your weapons technology into tools for building instead of destroying? The suggestion was revolutionary. Neither race had considered the possibility of creation in 800,000 years. Their entire industrial base was geared toward warfare. Their science was focused on developing better weapons. Their art was limited to military propaganda, but the idea took hold like a virus spreading through both fleets. Engineers began to imagine turning plasma cannons into terraforming tools. Shipwrights started thinking about building vessels for exploration instead of destruction. Scientists wondered what they could discover if they worked together instead of fighting. War singer Velnash felt her hatred beginning to transform into something else entirely. Not love, not yet, but curiosity about these beings she had been fighting for so long. How would such cooperation work? Our species are so different. Admiral Kethavar's crystal skin flickered through colors that had not been seen for millennia. The patterns of deep thought and wonder, rather than rage and determination. Perhaps our differences could be strengths instead of reasons for conflict. Your people can survive in environments that would kill us. Our technology could complement yours. Chen smiled as she watched the transformation spreading through both fleets. What had started as a simple conversation about beauty was becoming a complete reimagining of what both civilizations could become, the psychological foundation of the longest war in galactic. History was crumbling, not through force or threats, but through the simple act of remembering that there was more to existence than fighting, more to life than death, more to intelligence than the ability to destroy enemies. Individual ships from both fleets began to drift closer together. not in attack formations but in patterns that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. For the first time in 800,000 years, Kethmaran and Velthari vessels shared the same space without shooting at each other. The impossible was becoming reality. Peace was not just a word anymore, but a genuine possibility that both sides were beginning to embrace. 50 minutes to peace. The formal end of the war came at exactly 50 minutes after Captain Chen's first transmission. The moment was so quiet that it was almost missed by history. No grand ceremonies, no signing of treaties, no dramatic speeches, just two voices speaking simple words that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Admiral Kethavar spoke first, his crystal skin displaying colors that had not been seen for 800,000 years. Colors of peace, of wonder, of hope. Warsinger Velnash, we remember now. We remember who we were before the hatred consumed us. His voice carried across the communication channel to every ship in both fleets. Veterans who had fought in thousands of battles felt tears they had thought themselves incapable of shedding. The admission was more than just words. It was the death cry of a way of life that had lasted longer than most stars burned. Warsinger Velnash's response came after a long pause. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that had been absent from Velthari communication for millennia. The musical tones of a people who had once sung to growing plants and dancing stars. Admiral Kethvar, honored enemy, honored friend, the war is over. We choose to remember rather than forget. We choose to build rather than destroy. We choose to live rather than simply exist for killing. The word spread through both fleets like ripples in a calm pond. On thousands of ships, warriors who had known nothing but combat began to do something unprecedented. They began to remove their weapons, not because they were ordered to, but because they no longer wanted to carry tools of death. Captain Chen watched her sensors as the transformation accelerated beyond anything she had hoped for. The rigid military formations of both fleets dissolved like ice in warm water. Ships that had maintained perfect killing formations for millennia began to drift into organic, natural patterns that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. Kethmaran soldiers began transmitting art to Velthari vessels, not propaganda or military intelligence, but actual artistic creations that they had hidden in personal files for centuries. Music that spoke of beauty rather than glory in battle. Poems about crystal formations that sang in morning light. Stories about the joy of creation. Velthari ships responded by sharing their own suppressed cultural treasures. Songs about growing gardens in the void between stars. Genetic memories of their ancestors who had healed wounded worlds. Dreams about transforming dead planets into living paradises. The exchange of culture between the two fleets was like watching flowers bloom in a desert. Beautiful, unexpected, and full of promise for the future. Chen's final transmission to both fleets contained something more precious than any weapon: the complete archives of human peace-building techniques. Treaties and reconciliation processes that had ended conflicts on Earth. Stories of former enemies who had become friends, allies, even families. She gave them the tools to rebuild what 800,000 years of war had destroyed. Not just their ships and weapons, but their souls and their ability to dream of something better than endless conflict. The transformation was not limited to the command ships. Throughout both fleets, ordinary soldiers were experiencing revelations that would change their lives forever. Engineers who had spent their careers building better weapons began to imagine what they could create for peaceful purposes. Doctors who had only known how to treat battle wounds started thinking about healing in broader terms. Commander Velkith, who had commanded assault ships for 2 centuries, found herself designing gardens that could grow in the vacuum of space. The same creativity that had made her a deadly warrior was being redirected toward nurturing life instead of ending it. Captain Kethros, veteran of 3,000 battles, began composing music that incorporated both Kethmoran crystal harmonics and Velthari organic rhythms. His military mind, trained to analyze enemy weaknesses, was now focused on finding ways for 2 very different species to create beauty together. The most remarkable change was in the living ships of the Velthari fleet. These organic vessels, which had been bred for war over countless generations, began to physically transform. Their weapon systems retracted, their armor plating softened. Bioluminescent patterns that had been used for intimidation began to pulse with gentler rhythms that spoke of welcome rather than threat. Admiral Kethvar and Warsinger, Velnash met in person for the first time in their lives. Their ships docked in the space between their fleets, and the two commanders who had spent centuries trying to kill each other shook hands in the ancient human gesture of peace. The moment was broadcast to both fleets and beyond. News of the impossible peace spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Races that had given up hope for an end to the long war began to believe that even the most bitter conflicts could be resolved. Chen's ship, the Peacemaker, was invited to join the historic meeting. She found herself sitting between two beings who had been transformed from instruments of war into agents of peace. The conversation was awkward at first. Neither commander had much practice with friendly social interaction, but gradually became more natural. They began to plan a future that none of them had been able to imagine just hours before. Joint exploration missions to discover new worlds, cultural exchange programs to help both species recover their lost heritage, scientific collaborations that would benefit everyone. Most importantly, they began to plan how to heal the damage that 800,000 years of war had inflicted on the galaxy. Worlds that had been stripped of resources to feed the war machine. Species that had been forced to choose sides in a conflict that had nothing to do with them. Trade routes that had been abandoned because they crossed through the war zone. The work would take centuries, perhaps millennia. But for the first time in 800,000 years, both species had something to work toward instead of something to fight against. As the combined fleets began their journey back to their home systems, Chen prepared to leave. Her mission was complete, but she knew it was also just beginning. Word of the peace would spread and other conflicts would need mediators. Other wars would need to be ended with words instead of weapons. The Peacemaker departed quietly, just as it had arrived. But the legacy of Captain Sarah Chen and her 50-minute miracle would endure for as long as intelligent beings told stories about the power of hope over hatred, creation over destruction, and peace over war. The long war was over. The age of rebuilding had begun, and somewhere in the void between the stars, two former enemies worked together to create something beautiful where once there had been only death. The galaxy would never be the same.